Right, I'm here with a good friend of mine, Mr. Nick Turnbull, and we're here to talk about this area of suffering. Nick was a minister and is still a Christian, but not a minister anymore. And we're going to talk about a situation that obviously happened to Nick in his life, and hopefully we're also going to get some honest reflections about, as a Christian, how he managed to deal with that. Right, Nick, could you actually just give us a little bit of context for your for the situation that kind of we're talking about?
So this happened about 11 years ago, and we had our first son Joshua, and at 4 years old he started to get some headaches, and we went to the doctors a number of times about that he had a pain across his head. And the doctors continued to fob us off. After a number of times, we ended up actually going back into the hospital, much to do with Joshua's mum, and really pushing for it. And she actually managed to push to get a proper head scan. And consequently, by putting him through what they call a CAT scan, they found a tumour that ran from ear to ear right across the sort of front of his head. So there wasn't many signs. Often with brain tumours there can be issues with joints and everything else, but there wasn't. As soon as they found it, they rushed us off to King's College Hospital. I mean, that's the pragmatic. Of course, at the time our whole world just fell apart. He was only 4, and having a son with an illness like that, it was pretty intense. They then operated and took it out, and they tested it, and cancer is graded between 1 and 4, 1 being not so aggressive, 4 being very aggressive, and it was graded at 4, and it was obviously a life-threatening cancer, which after treatment a year later he actually died. So he died, he started at 3 and he died at 4 years old.
Okay, well that's again a really difficult situation to manage. Now, if you reflect back on it, obviously some time ago, as a Christian, because you were a minister, Christian minister at the time, what were the questions or the issues you felt as a minister, especially regarding kind of God, and God either being there if God was meant to be all loving, and here you were in a situation where your son was, having this kind of life-threatening, and ultimately which killed him.
Yeah, I think suffering is something that we don't particularly talk about here in the West. I've over the years taken young people to places like India and to some of the slums in Africa and to some of the slums there, and you meet people which live in absolute poverty and live in absolute suffering. I met one particular lady who'd lost, she'd had 5 children and lost 3 of them to basic medical issues because she wasn't able to get some of the basic health care that we do. She'd lost 3 children. The thing is, even sitting in that room still felt a long way from my reality. So I think the truth of the matter is, here in our world we don't like to talk about suffering, but when it's facing you straight on, and for me it was straight on, and for you or any of your students in your class, it can happen to us at any time. Suddenly does make you start to question all things about life. Now, obviously, as a Christian minister, I was there to, not only believe it, but to help others believe it as well, and the whole notion of praying. And so, to be quite frank, I struggled to believe that God really cared. I struggled to believe that there was a God, especially when you pray and a whole church prays and then nothing happens. So it starts to raise an awful lot of questions in my mind. And whilst I believe in God still, at the time, I can honestly say I very much doubted there was a God.
Okay. Obviously, from the suffering perspective, was there, I don't mean this crudely, when you reflect back, is there anything at all good that came out of that situation whatsoever?
Anything good that came out of that situation? I'm not sure if you'd use the word good. I think I would say I've personally changed. I think the way that I view God and the way I view life and the way that I pursue certain things, are very different. I think I have a different set, not a different set of beliefs, but I view God differently. I think for me personally, you know, we were at the time we were pregnant with our daughter, and I think we do appreciate our children much more than perhaps we did otherwise. But it's difficult to say what's good that comes from it in some ways. I think you just get through it, and it's not that you want to put it behind you, because obviously we live with that reality every single day.
Okay. There's a story in the Bible, and it's a story that I want the students to be aware of. It's a story of Job, and the story of Job is an Old Testament story where God seems to allow Job to go through a level of suffering, although he's done nothing to deserve the suffering. Did you think that the only people who suffered were the ones who deserved to suffer?
I think it's natural that you tend to think, the first question you say is, what have I done wrong? I think it's a very natural thing to do.
So with the story of Job, for example, the point is at the end of it, obviously God rewards his faith.
Yes.
And he doesn't lose his faith, although he's tempted to give up on his faith. Was that any consolation, or was that, you know, did you see this as a test of your faith?
Personally, I didn't see it as a test of my faith. I think if it was a test of my faith, that makes God incredibly cruel. So I think that's really, you know, and I think people say, you know, all these things happen for a reason, you know, God did this or God did that. I don't actually believe that, you know, I think God personally was hurting as much as perhaps we were and our friends were and our wider family were. I think God, the way that the world works is that in some ways God gives us choices and just life runs, because how do you equate for millions of people starving around the world when the rest of us here have got 3 good meals today, or we've got a roof over our head? You know, life isn't fair and life is tough, and that's it. So I think in some ways God just lets us get on with it. I think he does intervene. I don't think it was a test of my faith, but I would say at the end of all this, clearly I am still a Christian. Yes, I still believe in God. I got to a point of disbelief, but then I came across this question in a couple of books that said, you know, if God can't be trusted, then who else can I trust? If God cannot be trusted, then what else can I trust in? And I think for me, it's a bit simple, but I think when you look at life, you know, there is hope. There's hope for me. It's not just about hope beyond this life, it's about hope today, and knowing that God does have a purpose. I don't think God's purpose was for Joshua to die. It's happened. It's you know, that's life. People die of cancer. That's a tough part of life. So I don't think there was necessarily a reason, but I still live with an element of hope, both in this life and in the life to come.
What about those people that talk about suffering being... Because obviously your faith was tested, whether you liked it or not, there is an element of, although that wasn't maybe the reason, you cannot help but have your faith tested when you're choosing to believe or not believe in God. But now, as you reflect back on the hope, what do you hope for? What is it about that? Is that now something, do you hope... You know, for example, does your Christian hope go beyond the grave?
Okay, yeah, so obviously I have a hope that one day I will see Joshua. So it does go beyond the grave, that it's not just this life, but I do have a hope that one day there is a place called heaven. I have a hope in this life that life isn't just about crap, but it's actually can be purposeful as well. Clearly, we live in a world that is suffering, but in it, there is still hope. We have work, we have friendships, we have family, and actually there is a calling for us to help change the world in which we live. So I think in some ways it's inspired me to use my life and be much more purposeful, or even more purposeful than I was.
Thank you. How do you find meaning? How did you find meaning in all that kind of suffering? Because we're all living in a world where we're all trying to make sense of our lives, and as a Christian, how do you make sense of this particular event, or do you make sense of it?
The simple answer is I don't think you do make sense of it. If you tried to make sense of it, you'd go crazy, I think, is the honest truth. I thought there would come a stage as the years went by that I'd understand it. I don't understand it. That's the simple truth.
So you're talking about living with the questions.
That's it. So for me, that's a really important phrase. I don't live, often we all strive for answers, but I'm afraid that I've come to the conclusion that we somehow have to live with the tension that there's always going to be questions. And actually, when you ask one question, a whole set of new ones come about as well.
How do you think your faith through this situation has helped you in relating to other people better?
Yes, I think it has. I think it's made me far more compassionate. I think, like for anyone that goes through something which you haven't been through before, when someone else goes through it, you just have a level of empathy. So I think that's very much the case, and I think that I'm just just aware that I'm just aware that suffering's around me much more. Whereas before, perhaps I just wanted to put it behind me. I don't really want to talk about it. Don't want to really face it as much. When you can watch one channel that's talking about famine in Africa, it's easy to go over and just watch a reality show like Big Brother or something. I'm not saying that that is bad by any means. I'm just saying it's easier to watch that than it is the other.
As I'm thinking about, again, still kind of suffering, I'm trying to think about Christian responses to suffering.
Yeah.
And one of the questions students might get asked is, how would a Christian respond to suffering?
Yeah.
You're a Christian.
Yeah.
I know suffering obviously takes lots of forms.
Yeah.
How should a Christian respond to suffering? Is there one answer, or is there lots of answers?
Well, first of all, I think there's lots of answers, without a doubt. But somehow it's easy to believe the Bible and trust God and all the promises that the Bible makes when life is going well. It's a tougher thing to continue to believe in God and His promises when life is going bad. And I would say that's the test. So you asked me, was I tested? I said I didn't feel like it, and you're quite right, I was tested. The test was, can I believe in God in the good times and the bad times? So I think that's what a Christian has. That's the challenge, because it's easy just to let it all go just because things don't go the right way. Why not me? Is kind of what I say. Why wasn't it you? Why me? Well, actually, it was me. So get over it and get on with it. And actually, all the promises that God makes are still true.
Another point on this, I think maybe a kind of final point, would be obviously for a Christian, Jesus is the cornerstone, the centre of their faith.
Yeah.
And obviously Jesus suffered.
Yes.
And we remember that every Easter, but He also kind of came through it. Was the fact that Jesus suffered, how did that come into this situation at all?
Well, I think the fact that Jesus came to this earth and lived like us, and He went through suffering like none of us will go through. I think it shows. Well, I talked about empathy, didn't I? Not sympathy, but empathy. I think that recognises that I have a God who understands suffering profoundly. It's not so. You can't understand what it's like to lose a child, but you may have gone through some suffering that there's an element of empathy. But I think that I have a suffering God means that He does understand hurt, pain, crying.
So that was a kind of central part for you.
That's a central part for me, yeah.
In managing this sort. Do you think Christians should expect to suffer?
I think that everyone has to recognise that there's levels of suffering in this world, whether it's Christian or not.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick.